Beloved Lord, I first just want to say what a grace it is just to hear your word and to have you read your word as you are creating it week by week. It's just the most profound thing. And I feel we're so blessed to be able to be here with you and receive that as it's unfolding. Even the grace of seeing you turn your page as so everybody could see how you write your word.
And that was necessary on the first occasion, because I had it all there in the handwritten form. And the last two times I've been able to pass it to the editors a few hours before, and they present me a clean copy to read from.
You just mentioned tonight, and you've mentioned a few times that the translator of the Ashtavakra Gita, or the number of translators, there's something of a process of damping down that might occur because they can only translate as well as their present realization or point of view. And as you just said, your realization doesn't have that that limiting effect. One thing I've noticed about your word that I don't think I've ever seen any precedent for, and I first noticed this actually when I first read your word, and I'd never, I think, read word that hadn't been generated from the mind. Yours seemed to originate from, as you say, it was a radical teaching gone to the root, and that's what I felt. It went somehow all the way to truth. It never stopped the way mind word or point of view word would somehow stop at some fundamental or irreducible or something like that. And yours, it was truth, went all the way. And there is something about that seems to have then a quality of transmission. And I am aware of transmission from the spoken word of realizers of various degrees, but I don't think I've ever noticed a transmission of any degree, serious degree, from the written word of any realizer before. And the first time this really stood out to me was when I was reading the Mummery and reading some of the writings in there from Evelyn. And as you say, Evelyn borrows words. He borrows the concepts. He borrows the Dharma. He even borrowed your capitalization and parenthetical and some of the unique style of your source word. And yet, so everything seemed to be the same, and yet maybe there was a certain cadence that was all for that. It didn't have that quality of transmission. And even when I read, for instance, the translation of Ashtavakra Gita that the Dawn Horse Press published years back, it actually, it's profound teaching, no doubt, but it actually doesn't carry that living quality, in my perception of it at least, that living quality of transmission that is, I find, true of your word, spectacularly true of your word. And I don't know if that's because there's absolutely no precedent for it ever before, or this phenomenon of a translator damping it down, or what. But as far as I know, nobody's ever done what you've done with the written word. And my question really is that true? Is that part of your unique?
It should be so, yes. It is. Direct utterance coming from the source prior to mind. And this body is put in various circumstances, and people do things, say things, and so on. And this body responds and uses concepts, uses language. And modes of action and so on. But it's not coming from the ego base or from the mind. What takes forms of concepts, words, and so forth is a direct utterance from prior to the mind. It's not merely the mind talking from its own resource.
Mm-hmm.
So when there is utterance from the transcendental divine source, it is utterance of a unique kind, most profound. And true scripture has that characteristic then, should. This is the measure of it, that it comes as direct utterance from that source. Levels of life and life mind and so forth are part of communications, generally speaking. So there are realizers of various degrees, and therefore there are characteristics, psychophysical characteristics associated with each of the stages of life that are part of their expression and their sign and their words and their language of apparent thinking and so on. But when there is, as in this instance, no mind whatsoever behind this body, then what is spoken has a different force and characteristic altogether. And if you're noticing that, that's good. I'm using the Ashtavakra Gita in this manner. I'm not in a circumstance of dialogue with anybody. Otherwise, I'm living in isolation, and have been for some time, because of the nature of how this gathering has effectively confined me and so on. So, on any given day, then it's not that I'm in a room talking to people, and in that situation of people approaching me and stimulating the mechanism of this body here to be responsive and to speak from that primal source. You see, many of the texts were produced by that exchange in a circumstance where people approached me and I responded through the vehicle of this body. So it was that exchange, that interaction, people speaking, doing things, and so on, that was the circumstance in which utterances were made. But I wasn't in that circumstance recently, so the Ashtavakra Gita serves as a means to provoke this body to speak, or to speak in the form of written utterance, and then speak it here. So it's not an exchange with devotees that's producing this event of this Scapegoat's Book of Perfect Knowledge. It's happening in my room where I am alone, and fundamentally alone most of the time. And since there is no speech there, no exchanges there, and no devotees there, and provoking a dialogue or utterance from me, dialogue with me or utterance from me, the Ashtavakra Gita, the traditional text, is serving this purpose. It's like someone in the room there, saying this and that. And this body is provoked by that, or moved to utterance, and it's just being written down and continued by that speech of utterance coming from this book. And so sometimes I have that text in front of me, for instance, where I'm sitting at a desk and writing. I have a transliteration of the text from the Sanskrit there, and so on. And in that moment of immediacy, my own utterance is generated responsively. That's all occurring in a different sphere altogether. And this has become a happening in the room at a state mental facility near God's End, where Evelyn and Raymond are in this exchange. There are actual characters involved, and they have characteristics and so forth. This all has appeared spontaneously. I often use the time of this body being retired at rest to do all kinds of work. I do this all the time, in fact, daily. But there's sometimes I use that detachment from the physical association to write this book, for instance. So the notion spontaneously arose to make a translation of the Ashtavakra Gita, because I didn't like the traditional translations, and it's an important text, and I intended the Donhurst Press to publish it. So I just started to do that spontaneously, and it provoked this spontaneous happening of making the Scapegoat's Book. And perhaps it was the second day, I got up. It was going to be Raymond and Evelyn. But just spontaneously. It became that, the whole all the fundamental, comprehensive sense of the circumstance of this exchange arose spontaneously, and it's making a book spontaneously that is, in many respects, profoundly different from the Ashtavakra Gita. But the Ashtavakra Gita is provoking it. It's a kind of seed. I call it a seed text. You see, I let it stimulate this body. to provoke this body to utter this book. It's all happening spontaneously. It's not about some kind of active mind otherwise. It's totally spontaneous.
Mhm.